Gentleman yields. Mr. Connolly is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is not a moment of grace or bipartisanship or dignity for a storied committee here in the House of Representatives that has prided itself on all of the above. At this moment, war rages in the Middle East, in Gaza, in Lebanon, where the President and the Secretary of State are desperately trying to contain that conflict lest it expand into a region-wide conflict. They continue to make efforts at the United Nations where they are today and in other locales to achieve a ceasefire to stop the killing and the desolation in Gaza and to bring Israeli hostages home, including Americans. Those are noble efforts that this committee in normal times would respect. At the very least, this committee, given the urgency of the moment and the engagement of our President and Secretary of State in intense diplomatic negotiations and discussions, including Ukraine, I might add, at the United Nations, would have the respect to allow the President and his Secretary of State to undertake those endeavors on the country's behalf and to delay any action by this committee that could detract or impede those efforts. But not today. Today we're going to engage in a partisan exercise because we're 40 days out from an election and we want to score political points, including on the subject of Afghanistan. I find it ironic that the chairman would cite the fact that there were so few, if any, hearings on Afghanistan under a previous majority, when the Republican majority refused to have a single hearing on Russian interference in the 2016 election, despite multiple requests to do so, nor have the Republican majority currently had any hearings on the antecedent of what happened in Kabul. Mr. Sherman pointed out, it was President Trump and his negotiator, Ambassador Khalilzad, that precluded the Afghan government from even being at the table in the negotiations in Doha. Who were the Afghan representatives that we recognized, that the United States government under President Trump and Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, recognized? It was the Taliban, not the Afghan government. They weren't even allowed to sit at the table and participate in the future of their own country. Imagine the demoralizing effect that must have had on the Afghan government we purportedly supported and the military that buttressed it. No wonder it collapsed. Imagine the morale effect of agreeing to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners, many of whom were terrorists, which my colleague Joe Wilson correctly cites as of concern, except he forgets it was on the Trump administration watch, not the Biden administration watch, that saw that egregious action and agreed to it as part of a Taliban demand. And it was the Trump administration that set an absolute date for full U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. That trifecta destroyed the credibility of the Afghan government in Kabul we were purportedly supporting, energized the Taliban, and destroyed the ability of the Afghan military to resist the Taliban. And that led to the collapse in Kabul. But of course, we don't want to talk about that. And we don't want to have a hearing about that, because that would damage the narrative that we're undertaking today. This is, from my point of view, a real shameful moment for this committee, and I deeply regret that the majority would undertake this effort while the President and Secretary of State are negotiating very delicate matters on our behalf and on the behalf of world peace. I yield back.
Gentleman yields.